One of these days, I'm going to remember to hit the mute button before I start talking. um, but we are here, and while we're waiting for Azim Chowdhury to log, there's Azim. We'll have him on here shortly. I see a lot of familiar faces here. Thanks, guys, for joining us again, and for anybody listening to the recording later who happens to have stumbled upon CASAA and doesn't know what we do. We are the Consumer Advocates for Smoke-Free Alternatives Association, and you can find out all the stuff you need to know about us and what we're supporting here in terms of harm reduction, tobacco harm reduction, safer smoke-free alternatives to cigarettes at our website, CASAA.org, CASAA.org. We've got merch, we've got places to donate and all kinds of information, everything you need to know. So definitely check it out. Give us a follow here on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook to keep up to date with all the goings on. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Our special guest for today's Twitter space on a special day and time is Azim Chowdhury, known to many of us as the vape lawyer. I figured this is a pretty good opportunity after a couple of weeks of roller coaster news about Juul and vaping in general. Azim, maybe, actually, I guess I should start from square one here. Maybe take a moment to introduce yourself to our listeners, and then we'll get to the topic du jour.
Sure. Can you guys hear me
Yep.
okay? Great. Well, again, thank you to CASAA for inviting me to participate today. Certainly, I agree. There's a lot going on in this space, and I'm happy to provide any insight that I can to help you guys out. But for those of you who aren't familiar with my practice, I'm a partner at a firm in DC called Keller and Heckman. I've been practicing in the vape space for quite a while, actually, most of my career. I started back in 2009, shortly around the time of the enactment of the Tobacco Control Act, looking into how FDA might regulate the e-cig industry. And my team here at Keller and Heckman, we're a bunch of lawyers, scientists, and litigators who are advising companies in this space on mostly matters of FDA compliance, regulatory compliance on global issues, but also state and other federal rules and regulations.
I honestly, I must admit, I'm a little embarrassed. I didn't remember or didn't know that your history went back that far. You're kind of OG vaping policy guy. So thanks for sticking around, honestly.
Yeah, if you ask me every few years if I thought I'd still be doing this, I'd probably say no. But I think that's a testament to the industry that we're still around, able to hire lawyers like me to help out. So despite everything, the industry is surviving, and I'm here for the long run.
Excellent. Yeah, we're going to get us one of those something vis-a-vis Ukrainian soldier standing on the banks of an island giving the bird to the Russian warship at one of these points. So yeah. So great. Well, let's get right into it. The main topic of discussion here has been, as I said, the roller coaster ride of the Juul marketing denial orders. You are definitely in a much better position to kind of bring everybody up to speed on this. So if you could maybe give a little bit of background about the recent news and how we got to where we are today with the Juul.
Sure. Yeah. No, Juul is the whole situation there has been quite the surprising run of events of the last couple of weeks here, but. Most recently, FDA has administratively stayed the marketing denial order that they issued to Juul back on June 23rd, which means that they effectively have pulled it back for the time being while they re-review it. But to start from the top, as I'm sure most of you know, all e-cigarette products, all ENDS products are subject to FDA pre-market review. Products that have been on the market since August 2016, which was the date of the deeming rule effective date, were subject to, following a court order, PMTA deadline of September 2020. Juul and many other companies timely submitted their applications. Now, of course, Juul's application was, from their public statements, quite comprehensive. I think they announced they submitted over 110 different studies, both clinical trials, non-clinical studies. They completed, loads of different types of assessments of their e-liquids, behavioral studies, many of which were published and peer-reviewed. And they had the funding to do so. This is a company, of course, that is, it doesn't have an issue with funding in terms of their ability to actually conduct the studies and get that work done in order to meet the PMTA standard, which of course is demonstrating the product is appropriate for the protection of the public health. But of course, Juul is Juul, right? They have this history that it was always a bit unclear how FDA was going to respond to their application because of this history of being kind of the company that everyone points to with respect to kind of jump-starting the quote-unquote youth vaping epidemic and their maybe ill-advised marketing practices from many years ago. Juul, of course, submitted PMTAs for their tobacco and menthol pods, having pulled back their flavors, their non-tobacco flavors, back in 2018, following the uproar regarding the youth issue. So, given the fact that Juul had submitted very comprehensive applications, that they were focusing on tobacco and menthol, that they are not the product that obviously they've been, they've rebranded. Essentially, they don't market the way they used to. And they aren't as popular amongst the young people as other products, right, that have taken over, flavored disposables, for example. All that being said, the expectation was, given the quality of their application and those issues, it was just a matter of time before FDA was going to authorize their products through the PMTA process. And of course, despite the political pressure that we have seen from many members of Congress, from, of course, the public health groups, the tobacco control groups, that have viewed and continue to view Juul as the boogeyman. And so when the announcement came, through the FDA leak, I guess, to the Wall Street Journal, that Juul's applications were going to be denied, I think it's fair to say most everyone following this issue closely was a bit surprised. Despite that political pressure and despite everything else, FDA is supposed to be an agency that follows the science, that makes science-based decisions, and unless there was a clear youth issue or something that we were not aware of, I think we all expected Juul to get authorization, at least for their tobacco flavors. So when the MDO announcement came from FDA the next day, it was, again, another surprise to see that rather than denying the application for, say, past marketing behavior or the fact that Juul is still the top 5 products identified by youth or other youth issues, FDA basically said that they did not get a complete tox profile of the product. In more specifically, that the MDO, from what I understand, raised concerns about the presence of certain chemicals that could be leaching from the pods into the liquids and therefore could end up being inhaled. And what FDA ultimately said was, because they did not have a complete picture of the tox profile of the product, they couldn't say for sure whether or not it would be appropriate for the protection of the public health, even if smokers, adult, cigarette smokers, were switching to Juul. And this is, that, again, a strange, conclusion, considering the alternative is the most harmful product, combustible cigarettes. But their MDO focused on Juul apparently not providing this data or not addressing their question. We know that Juul's applications, unlike the many other small businesses whose applications for flavored products were denied last year, Juul's application actually got a phase 3 scientific review. And they actually had a chance to respond to a deficiency letter that FDA issued to them sometime last year, and which is many companies, didn't get that opportunity. And so, FDA said that, Juul's response to that deficiency and their incomplete tox profile forced them to make this decision to deny the application. Of course, then Juul immediately filed a petition for review in the D.C. circuit. They're now based in Washington, D.C. And under the TCA, companies have 30 days following the denial of a PMTA to request judicial review of that denial. So Juul did that pretty promptly, and also they filed for an emergency stay, an emergency administrative stay of the MDO, citing to the fact that apparently they had submitted this data, thousands of pages worth of HPHC aerosol data that apparently FDA didn't review. And that, of course, without the stay, their business was going to be irreparably harmed, which is one of the factors for getting a stay. And the D.C. Circuit actually, I think within 24 hours, issued that stay, saying that they were going to issue the stay, meaning Juul could continue to sell their products despite the MDO, while they more formally reviewed the actual stay request over the next couple of weeks. In the meantime, though, a couple of days ago, FDA essentially pulled back the MDO by issuing their own administrative stay. And my interpretation of that, and I'll pause here to take any questions, but my interpretation is that, as we've seen FDA do in other situations with respect to the flavored MDOs, they've recognized as a result of the litigation that they did, in fact, miss some data, surprisingly, that Juul submitted, and that they were going to essentially put the MDO on hold while they re-review the basis for the MDO. And in fact, if they determine that there is data missing that needs to be assessed, I believe that at that point FDA could rescind the MDO entirely, and therefore put Juul's PMTAs back into scientific review for a complete assessment of that data. Or they could go the other way. They could decide that they're going to stick to their guns after they've reviewed what Juul says was missing, and come back and say, even after we've reviewed that data, we still think it's incomplete. We're going to deny your products, and we're going to lift the administrative stay at that point, in which case the litigation is back on. So maybe I'll pause there. I probably spoke for too long, but let me know if that makes sense.
No, excellent. Thank you for the sort of comprehensive update here, and very much appreciate that. I had a couple of questions, but maybe sticking with the litigation here. I know I had sort of seen some comments that I guess FDA would it responds better, or would rather deal with lawyers, or I'm sorry, would I can't remember exactly what somebody said. I'm sorry, I'm screwing this up, but ultimately the question is, I don't know that anybody believes that FDA honestly just forgot to read or missed this 6,000 pages of data. And so my question and I guess concern is, I mean, this all feels a lot more like strategy than it feels like FDA, giving the college try at actually authorizing a product here. Does that sound right?
It's certainly a reasonable interpretation of what FDA could be thinking. I can't say for sure whether they actually missed this or not. It seems surprising because this is Juul. This is the PMTA that everyone was waiting for. This is the PMTA that they had, over 2 years to review, or had been reviewing for over 2 years. This is the application that presumably FDA had kind of the most personnel on top of. So for them to miss key data and then issue a very aggressive denial and press release that was in many ways different from other press releases and other denials where they were kind of very very openly telling retailers to stop selling products, is a bit was a bit shocking in my interpretation. Um, could this be part of a strategy? Sure. I mean, again, I think it's odd that FDA official. I know Commissioner Califf in some statements mentioned, that this was going to be that this denial of Juul was, part of FDA's plan to overall reduce harm to youth. But the actual denial itself, as I mentioned, didn't get into the youth issue, right? It seems like they focused on this very specific scientific issue that Juul was able to rather easily defend. It seems, again, we haven't seen the final result of all this, but very quickly was able to come up with arguments, scientific factual arguments to counter FDA's the basis for their denial. To me, it almost seems, and this is purely, conjecture on my part, that FDA, in a way, felt like it had to deny the application because of other pressures. And now they're getting to a point where if the courts or, come back and tell them otherwise, it's not their fault. They tried to deny it, but the court said they couldn't because, the data was there, or FDA needs to review more data. And so they may, if they end up coming to a different decision later on, it wasn't because they didn't try to ban Juul initially. Again, pure conjecture on my part. But to me, again, it's hard to ignore all the outside factors that are at play here.
Yeah, it seems like there's really only one of two options, in this scenario. Either FDA is woefully inept and in fact did miss thousands of pages of documents, in the PMTA, which it is their job to review, and they have had 2 years to do. So either they are incapable of doing the one job they were assigned, or this is, like you mentioned, some form of strategy or, political theater, so
Right.
that they can, placate the anti-vaping groups and make it look like, oh, like you said, we tried to deny them. Look, we didn't want to do this, but the courts have now forced us, And I think either of those options coming from the Food and Drug Administration is terrible. Like, whether either they are inept or they are, totally at the whim of political pressure, neither of which is a good outcome.
I totally agree with that.
I did. The other question that I had that you sort of brought up was, I've heard. I can't remember who said it, but there was apparently no way that FDA could deny Juul's application based on the whole the manufactured youth vaping epidemic, but you brought it up with the considering past marketing practices, and this is something I think that has implications for the rest of the industry. Obviously, we've seen a lot of questionably designed marketing through over the years. This is certainly not just a new thing, but I guess I'm interested in if FDA does have that option to deny an application based on past marketing practices, why didn't they just come out and say that? Why this whole charade?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we're obviously, we don't have a ton of data points on this issue yet because FDA didn't really do its job with the PMTAs in the first place, right? They found a roundabout way of denying 99% of applications for this fatal flaw, right? Not having a randomized controlled trial or longitudinal study for a flavor, comparing it to a tobacco flavor. And so FDA failed to actually review companies' applications and give substantive product specific MDOs or deficiency letters. So we still don't really know what FDA's thinking is on that type of specific question on past marketing practices. I don't think FDA would be able to deny an application solely based on past marketing. I think it would have to be a combination of, here are some examples from your past where you, in FDA's view, perhaps were targeting, kids or youth, and the fact that your current marketing plan, doesn't adjust for that properly, or there's a youth issue with your products today. I think it would have to be tied in to what's happening today and what is appropriate for the protection of public health of today's population. So, but I don't think it's a non-factor, right? I don't think it's a non-factor. I think it would have been hard for FDA to, for that reason, deny Juul based on what it did back in 2015, with that marketing campaign when they launched, when Juul could come back and say in court, here's where we are today. We don't sell flavors. We don't market to kids. Here's our data on who's using our products. So I think, FDA wouldn't be able to solely rely on that type of a past behavior issue to deny an application. One thing I would like to note, though, while we're on the topic of Juul, to me, and again, I don't know if this is part of FDA's, some strategy that we don't know about. I don't know, but in looking at their denial of Juul based on this toxicity issue, it's almost as if FDA had to, twist their arm to come up with this denial, because what they essentially were doing is treating the application as if it was a true pre-market application, meaning as if Juul wasn't already on the market being used by 2 to 3 million people. And in that sense, if this was truly a new product that was just being introduced, that had not been introduced yet, that FDA was reviewing for the first time, I could see FDA saying, okay, we need to have a very clear understanding of the tox profile before we let it come to market, so that we know whether or not, this is going to be a safe alternative to smoking. And but treating it that way and ignoring the reality that this is a product that is being used by millions of adults whose alternative may be smoking cigarettes, that to me is a fundamental misunderstanding of the APPH standard, because you can't ignore, that people who are using the product today might switch and go back, and who are former smokers might otherwise be smoking a much more harmful product. And it seems like FDA kind of pretended like that wasn't part of their analysis, and ignored it when it should have been a key feature of how they reviewed the application.
Yeah, that is a little bizarre. FDA does seem to be doing an awful lot of pretending lately, in proposing the ban on menthol and this very low nicotine standard. Sort of as you've sort of, I guess, illustrated here, that, what's the alternative for people that's going to be buying illicit cigarettes, which, arguably that causes or creates new questions, new issues, new public health concerns. And that does not, hopefully those are things that FDA will take seriously in reading all of the comments on these rules. But It just seems that, moving forward with these rules, it seems that the agency is ignoring that, the darker side of the consequences here. So, yeah, I think maybe we've probably given Juul itself a quite a bit of coverage here. That was sort of the big news story. Danielle, I don't know if you had any more to say or questions about Juul.
No, I think a lot of it is just going to be, a wait and see kind of game.
Yeah, so I guess if there were anything else to touch on this topic, Azim, what's kind of the timeline here? How much time does FDA have to come to a decision on this now? And any expectations going through the next couple of months?
Yeah, we there's no specific timeline or deadline for FDA to make a decision on whether or not it's going to rescind the MDO entirely. We've seen in other cases in the flavor MDOs where companies like Turning Point, for example, they went through a similar situation where they got denied their application and went back to FDA and said, you didn't see this data we provided. And FDA agreed eventually and rescinded the MDO within a few weeks. Now, I think, where we're probably it's going to take FDA a little bit longer than that to make a decision. And again, I think obviously, given the political ramifications and whatever bigger picture issues and strategies they're dealing with, it could probably be a few months. I know that in the court order that granted the joint motion that FDA and Juul filed to put the case in abeyance, I think the court requested some status updates every few weeks. So before the court moves forward with the appeal process and setting a briefing schedule for the appeal, they've asked for somewhat regular updates from the FDA. But I think this could probably, take several weeks or months before we know whether or not there's going to be an actual appeal if the MDO isn't rescinded, or if the FDA does agree to rescind the MDO and put the applications back into review.
All right, and while we're on the topic of courts and judges doing science instead of the science organization, and I am not totally up to speed on this case, but what's the status of the Triton case? And the question that was handed to me was, what's taking so long?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm a bit surprised that we haven't had a decision on the merits of the Triton case in the Fifth Circuit. Although, these things, it's again, there's no deadline for the court to make a decision. Courts have sat on cases for months or sometimes years. But the Triton case was, obviously this is the case in the Fifth Circuit where we had the opinion on the stay of that MDO, which the court kind of called FDA out for this switcheroo for suddenly requiring companies to test their flavors in a way that they never required before. In that case, moved pretty quickly. They had an oral argument, I believe, back in January, and now it's obviously we're in July. So, I think it could come anytime at this point. I certainly think we could see a decision before the end of the summer. But there's no guarantee. There's no timeline. It's possible for the court to wait until even up to a year. But that's the case that's kind of leading the pack. There have been other cases that have now also had oral arguments in the 11th Circuit. There were a number of petitioners. They had arguments back in May. The 7th Circuit had an argument before that. So it's just a matter of waiting to see which one of these circuits will issue a decision first, and hopefully in favor of the industry.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Of course, that hasn't really gotten us very far, but we'll keep them crossed anyway. I guess moving abruptly along, the other question is about synthetic nicotine, and I don't know, what level of involvement you've had with folks submitting PMTAs for synthetic nicotine products, but the question is. Is synthetic nicotine going to become an enforcement priority for FDA now?
Yeah, great question. So synthetic nicotine, became subject to the Tobacco Control Act back on March 15th, and of course, that legislation gave companies a mere 60 days to file PMTAs, which of course we know is a process that should take years and take long-term data. If FDA is seeking long-term data, basically impossible to do a complete job of in 2 months. But the legislation gave companies that brief period of time to submit applications by May 14th. And for companies who got applications in by that deadline, the legislation gave them an additional 60 days until I think July 13th, which is coming up now next week, to essentially market the products that are subject to those applications without the threat of enforcement. Come July 14th, however, the synthetic nicotine products that don't have an actual authorization, an actual PMTA grant order, then become technically illegal in violation of the pre-market review requirements of the statute. And FDA has the ability, subject to its enforcement discretion, to enforce, regardless of your PMTA status, unless you're authorized. So what does that mean? Well, it means that even though companies have not received acceptance letters or filing letters, or we have really no idea. I haven't heard anything about even how many applications FDA has received. I know the first time around, it was we quickly learned from FDA that there were millions of applications filed. I personally haven't heard a peep as to how many applications actually were submitted, but presumably, based on folks that my clients and I know others, to me it sounds like there may have been maybe even more PMTAs submitted for synthetic nicotine products than even the original applications. But come July 13th or July 14th, FDA has the ability, even if an application is still pending, to force synthetic nicotine products off the market, to begin the enforcement process by sending warning letters to companies and saying, even though you submitted a PMTA, we're going to ask you to come off the market because we have the authority to do so, because of the risk to youth, for example, while we review your application. Don't know exactly what's going to happen on July 13th. It's possible. I think what FDA would do is, target companies, certain brands, the Puff Bars of the world, potentially, or the nicotine disposables, and specifically ask those products to come off the market, even if they have PMTAs pending, and hopefully not do something more drastic and try to somehow force all synthetic nicotine off the market.
Yeah, and this is probably a good opportunity to mention that we do have an active call to action on our website in support of the American Vapor Manufacturers Citizens Petition to FDA, urging to keep the open system products for which with synthetic nicotine, for which a PMTA has been submitted, to be allowed to stay on the market through the July 14th deadline. And so we had if you're a new listener or a previous listener and you just didn't hear it, we did a whole Twitter space about the synthetic nicotine citizens petition. You can go back, you can find that on all of our podcast places. We're on SoundCloud. We're on Spotify now. So definitely check that out and submit your comments in support of the citizens petition. And hopefully we won't see another hopefully we won't see a mass exodus of these products at the hands of FDA. So back to it. You kind of brought up this whole synthetic nicotine thing. I think should probably bring up some concerns for folks, because this was an amendment to the Tobacco Control Act, something that I know when I first got involved in all of this, for several years, the feedback that we were hearing was that members of Congress really didn't have any appetite for opening up the Tobacco Control Act again. And I sort of interpreted that as, they didn't want to do anything one way or the other. Let's let the law do what the law is supposed to do. Clearly, that is not what the law is doing. But so we did have this recent amendment for synthetic nicotine. And then over the past week, Representative DeSaulnier from California tried to get something wedged into the National Defense Appropriations Act, the NDAA. Fortunately, we're seeing reports that has been stripped out, or it's just not going to be put in. But the question is, are members of Congress now starting to feel like they need to get the Tobacco Control Act stricter than it already is? And obviously with DeSaulnier's amendment, which seemed absurdly focused on vapor products, certainly folks are trying to do this, but the question for you is, in your travels around DC, is do people seem to be a little bit more amenable to tightening the screws here?
Well, we've always seen, this heightened concern from members of Congress and senators, excuse me, pushing for new legislation, whether it's to ban flavors or in this case to force recalls of products on the market. So I'm not entirely surprised to see that. I don't think that legislation would have. I actually hadn't seen it. I just recently heard about that proposal, and again, to me, it just seemed like a ridiculous attempt to try to kind of just gain attention, probably as we get closer to the midterms, without any real chance at that kind of thing passing. But no, I think we have this very aggressive, House Oversight Committee. We have a couple of very aggressive senators, more than a couple, that despite all the problems that we are facing in today's world, they see vaping as just kind of like the go-to issue, I think, to demonstrate some sort of, badge of honor, that they're protecting the public health, or they're protecting kids, or they're doing something, to the benefit of society. And it just seems like vaping is the punching bag, and we see it every year. And my bigger concern with the way Congress treats the vaping issue is that it always seems like, and this happened with synthetic nicotine legislation. It happened with the PACT Act amendment back at the end of 2020, where rather than actually bringing legislation to the floor and debating it and having it become law through the process that the laws are intended to go through, these vaping bills are always these riders or add-ons to legislations that have nothing to do with the FDA or tobacco or vaping. They're appropriations bills or spending bills that they tack on this language to amend a definition of the PACT Act to include vaping, or to change the definition of a tobacco product to include non-tobacco products. and those are passing, right? They're getting the votes and getting those through, shoving those through. And vaping is always the industry that gets getting the short end of it and not getting their really their, you can always see their due process to have their arguments heard as to whether those types of laws are potentially could have negative public health consequences. We're not even having that debate in Congress. It's just this presumption that vaping is bad, and any law that restricts vaping in some way or denies it or bans it is going to benefit the public health. And that has to change. There has to be more discussion about the harms that these types of laws could have on the population.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is really my question here is we saw after the MDO for Juul came out, we saw Krishnamurthy get together with the PAVE ladies and take a victory lap. And sort of openly admit to coercing FDA or I guess influencing is the more appropriate word to make this decision. But as you're talking about, vaping sort of being the most popular scapegoat, and this opportunity for lawmakers to kind of whip up votes and get attention, especially going into the midterms. But my question is, and forgive my naivete, and not a political science person, are there any consequences for this? I mean, we're supposed to have a scientific review. The regulators should be functioning somewhat independently of political pressure. Should people like Krishnamurthy, Dick Durbin, and Desaulniers, should there be consequences for what they're doing, or are there consequences other than votes?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not sure if I'm the right person to have an answer to that question, but I personally believe there should be consequences, right? I mean, I think there should be a limit to how much influence politicians have on these decisions from the agencies, and because really it just comes down to who has the most funding and the most lobbying power to influence those decisions, and obviously the folks at the Bloomberg Philanthropies and others have put in billions of dollars at this point into this fight, which the vaping industry, the independent vaping industry, just has no way to compete with. So I mean, there needs to be consequences for undue influence. I know it's something that some folks have looked into. But the reality is, I think what we learned following the Juul decision is that there is almost no fear, right, of coming out and in Frank, it seems like these members of Congress are falling over themselves to take credit for the Juul denial. And anytime PMCAs are denied, it's to them, they must be doing their own risk benefit analysis and determining that it's to their benefit to be on one side of this and to claim victory, to claim that this is their doing, even if it it makes it seem like they're inappropriately influencing what should be scientific decisions from an independent federal agency. So until there, and at this point, I guess the only real consequence is if there's enough, like you said, votes on the other side to punish them with. But they clearly, are speaking to their base and believe this is going to help their, individual causes. To stay in Congress. So until there's broader kind of changes within how our structure works, I don't really know if there's going to be any way to force something, some other kind of results here.
Yeah, well, it was interesting reading over, I think it was AVM that posted one of Juul's, pardon me, I'm not a lawyer, but one of their recent filings. It was like a partially redacted version. But they even went so far in that to specifically call out particular, legislators and talk about this sort of undue influence on the FDA. And they had everything that they were citing was in the public record, right? Because these legislators, they go on live streams or they do, public, speaking engagements. And they clearly, like we mentioned, take credit for this. And Juul argued that in one of their filings that we saw. And so it seems to me like there is no technical, rule breaking, because I would think if there were, these politicians wouldn't be so, unabashedly taking these victory laps, and Juul wouldn't have so much public data to cite, showing proof of this. And it just seems kind of wild that they, what is the purpose? I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but what is the purpose of having an independent scientific regulatory body whose job it is to make these decisions and look this over if the politicians are just going to demand that they do, whatever they want, right? Like, what is the purpose of the FDA if they can't even make their own decisions? That's just what seems crazy to me.
And it undermines the public health and the confidence that the public, should have in these agencies to make these right decisions. And that to me is really the saddest part of this whole thing.
Yeah, so maybe swinging the pendulum another direction here, the last thing, and we might be able to let you go a little early depending on how this goes. I know your time is precious, and thank you again for coming to speak with us. But I think was it last week's last week or the week before? I'm getting lost here. The Supreme Court decision, West Virginia versus EPA. We've been getting some questions as to whether or not that decision has any effect on other regulatory agencies, specifically FDA and FDA's tobacco regulations. Did you have a chance to kind of look into that, and did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So, I'm certainly not an expert on Clean Air Act or the EPA regulations, but basically my understanding is that, what the EPA promulgated rules that essentially would allow or force utility companies to seek out alternative forms of electricity production beyond coal, cleaner forms like wind and solar energy. And the question was, did Congress in that statute, the Clean Air Act, provide the EPA with that clear authorization and the statutory language to develop those kinds of rules and requirements? And the Supreme Court held in that case that they hadn't. That the language that those regulations were based on in the statute was language that had never been interpreted that way before. Again, I'm not an expert on the Clean Air Act, but it was kind of a novel interpretation of that statutory language, and because essentially what the EPA was requiring companies to do had such political and economic significance that Congress could not have intended EPA to do something like that unless it was very clear in the statute that they could do that. And again, in this case, in the EPA case, they decided it wasn't clear that they could do that. Interestingly, in the opinion of that decision, they refer back to the old Brown and Williamson v. FDA case, which you might be familiar with. That's the case that Supreme Court decided back in 2000, when back in the 90s, back in 1996, prior to the Tobacco Control Act, FDA attempted to regulate cigarettes and smokeless tobacco as drugs or drug delivery devices, based on the principle or the idea that nicotine was addictive, and the tobacco companies were essentially using cigarettes and tobacco to deliver nicotine into the body. And because they knew about the nicotine's effect on the body and its addictiveness, that therefore they were intending those cigarettes to be essentially drugs. And that case went up to the Supreme Court. The FDA actually finalized a rule that did that gave FDA authority to regulate cigarettes as drugs, which of course would mean that cigarettes would have to go through a new drug application and this, prove safety and effectiveness, which of course would not be possible with a combustible product. And the Supreme Court held in Brown and Williamson that Congress could not have intended FDA to have authority to regulate the tobacco industry as drugs, because that would have been such a remarkable change in how they regulate the tobacco industry. And it would have essentially resulted in the banning of cigarettes because, as I mentioned, cigarettes could never meet that safety and effectiveness standard for drugs. And we know from the history of how Congress has regulated tobacco and cigarettes through different, legislation requiring warnings and advertising restrictions, for example, that Congress never intended FDA to try to ban cigarettes as drugs. And so that was actually, I think, mentioned in the opinion of this case as an example of where the Supreme Court has not allowed an agency to to do something where they didn't have clear authority to do so. So that's kind of the background. And I've been getting this question a lot. How does that help us today, if at all, with where we are with the Tobacco Control Act? Because the difference now, which is the reason why it doesn't automatically help us here, is because we now do have the Tobacco Control Act. We do have a statute that gives FDA very clear authorization over tobacco products, which now includes anything, whether it's synthetic nicotine or not. It does have very clear requirements for pre-market authorization. It does have give FDA a clear ability to deem things to be tobacco products. And we have had challenges to the deeming rule in the past. When the deeming rule became effective back in 2016, there were a number of challenges to the statute, to the deeming rule. And, we're here because they all failed, unfortunately. And if you look back at the legislative history of the Tobacco Control Act, there was discussion about the industry and even e-cigarettes. There was discussion about e-cigarettes, which are a fairly new product at the time, and how they would fall under, FDA's tobacco authority. So the bottom line is there's not an immediate sort of, we can point to this EPA decision to now say, FDA doesn't have authority over e-cigarettes or, can't require PMTAs. Like, I don't think there's something that obvious. But, I have been thinking about this, and I know this question has come up. There may still be a way, to somehow use this opinion. And again, this is totally, at this point, hypothetical. But one argument potentially is that, what FDA has done through the PMTA process by banning, at this point, 99% of all flavored products that have applied, you could argue that they've essentially established a de facto flavor ban, and that really any kind of flavor ban should really only come from come through the rulemaking process, through a product standard, which FDA has authority to do under the Tobacco Control Act. So again, haven't had a chance to flush this out yet, but there may be a way of arguing, does FDA have clear authorization from Congress to basically ban flavored ends without going through the rulemaking process? Does it have authority to do that through the Section 910 pre-market review process when they should be going through, a Section 907 rulemaking process? Again, perhaps that's a bit of a stretch, but it's something to think about. I'm sure some smart people will look into this and try to see if there's a way to make that kind of an argument, to kind of throw the industry, an opportunity here. But of course, that being the case, I think the other side of that argument is that Congress clearly give FDA authority to require all new products to go through pre-market review and to prove that they are APPH. If the result of that is that flavors don't get through, that's just how it is. Congress gave them that authority. So again, I hope, does that answer your question?
I think it does. And I of course, I think I have another question, which is, based on the appropriate for the protection of public health. That seems to be a bit of an ambiguous standard. I know that, FDA is always been really good about just citing or quoting the statute back to people. But, this idea of all that I can really come up with is that FDA has sort of come up with this ambiguous, not really clear balance of, youth use versus adult switching. But I'm sort of curious if there's more work that can be done to kind of hold FDA's feet to the fire to sort of concretely establish the APPH standard, rather than just kind of it just doesn't seem very clear to me what that is, and I don't know that anybody has actually come up with a succinct definition of what is appropriate for the protection of public health in this case. So I don't know if there was a question there, but that certainly got me thinking about it.
No, I think it's a great comment. I think I think we need to look into this closely and see if there's a way that this rule could help us. Given that in general, I think it's the fact that the Supreme Court is saying that the agencies they need to have clear authority to do what they do. In general, I think that's a good thing. And whether it's with PMTA process or something else, FDA needs to be held accountable here. And going back to what we talked about earlier, accountability, do they have clear authority to implement the rule, the statute, the way they are doing so? Do they need to define APPH in a more clear fashion? What are the requirements for those to meet that standard? They can't keep moving the goalposts and changing the rules, behind closed doors, and then denying companies and not giving companies a chance to answer questions or prove themselves, right? Can FDA be held to account to use the science like they're supposed to?
Yeah, and of course, so we've almost managed to squeeze the full 60 minutes out of you. But just, I guess, one more comment, and I guess a reminder for folks who aren't aware of what getting a PMTA actually means. These authorizations are not chiseled in stone, and they can be brought up for review. I know with MRTP it's every 3 years. I assume it's similar with the PMTA, and so having some sort of concrete standards, I think, gives companies, as you're saying, confidence that they will continue to have this marketing authorization renewed or available. But if, like you said, FDA continues to change the goalposts, anybody that's gotten an authorization has to be operating knowing that that's sort of always in jeopardy.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, the PMTA process requires post-market surveillance. So once an authorization is granted, that's not the end of the day. You still have to provide FDA a very detailed post-market surveillance strategy. You have to monitor exactly, where and how you're selling your products. And if there's any hint of a concern, that it's being used by youth or someone else that shouldn't be, FDA could pull back that authorization. And so, yeah, none of this is written in stone, which, again, another reason why I'm surprised, we saw a denial in Juul's case, because FDA could have very easily authorized it and then monitored very closely to make sure that, kids were not getting a hold of it. And if that ever happened, it would be pulled back. So that authority does exist.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, like I said, we've managed to have you for the full hour here. Again, thank you very much for joining us, Azim, and giving us your time today and helping to clear up all of these things. But before I get into the closing spiel, I guess I should give you and Danielle an opportunity to pipe in if there's anything that we missed or didn't pay enough attention to. Now's the moment to shine the light on it.
No, I think we covered quite a bit. And again, thanks for having me.
All right, fantastic. All right. Well, with that, we'll close out today's edition of CASAA's Twitter Spaces. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to all the regulars who keep showing up to this stuff and keep doing all the work that we need done. And of course, the overarching theme here is that for as much as we've been talking about companies and their applications and the things that they're facing, all of this comes back on the consumers. And so, we want to make sure that we're going to have consistent access to products that we enjoy that help us stay off of cigarettes. And so thank you, Azim, for all the work that you've done, and for a lot of the folks listening in our space here that continue to tirelessly work and make sure that not only are people switching to these products, but these products can stay available. And with that, thank you once again for listening. You go check out our website, CASAA.org. We've got merch, we've got a donate button, and we've got all the information you need to learn about tobacco harm reduction and ways that you can get engaged and talk to lawmakers and hope that we can keep this silly nonsense to a minimum. No guarantee that that's going to happen. But with that, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you all back here in a couple weeks.